Well, in the 70s, the music was changing actually quite a bit because when I started listening to music or paying attention to it, and I was pretty young in the 70s, it was transitioning from sort of the genre of the Beatles in the 60s and a lot of folk to a lot of rock and roll with bands like Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones. The Beatles were still prevalent in terms of what was playing on the radio, and then as it shifted from sort of the mid 1970s to late 1970s, you had sort of the rise of pop and, of course, disco, which was big if you were going to sort of the roller skating rink, which was sort of a huge place for people, especially young people, to sort of go and hang out, and that's where a lot of people listen to music as well. Well, it's still heavily focused on songwriting and musicians who could really play instruments. You know, more and more was being done in the studio and less live recording. But compared with what's going on today, it's hard to call somebody really a singer-songwriter. There's less and less of those in mainstream where they're more performing. Their singing is not necessarily great, or it's really heavily enhanced in studio production or post-production. And you've got instruments being added in with the rise of what anybody can do on a computer. So the music back in the 1970s, a lot of people look back at it and are a little bit nostalgic for it because it was really people singing and writing their own music and playing real instruments, and the sound of it was in some ways more authentic and raw, and I think a lot of people, it still appeals to a lot of people as a result of that. I mean, if you take a look at the Rolling Stones and their influence with the blues and American music, their music sounds very, very different too, with a lot of the music being produced today.
So the music during the 70s was very based on the actual music and the lyrics and the audience and trying to get some sort of reaction out of them.
I think there was a different relationship between the music that was taking place in the 1970s, and certainly that's coming out of the 1960s as well. The relationship between a band or a singer-songwriter and the audience, I think it's very, very different than what's going on today. Clothing in the 1970s was very interesting because a lot of it was heavily influenced by material. A lot of synthetic material came into play, moving away from cotton and sort of what was taking place in the 1960s, and things like leisure suits and pantsuits for women. Coming out of the 60s with a lot of mini skirts and everything else. In the 1970s, women were, really challenging what they had previously been, felt that they had to wear, and they were given a lot more freedom as they entered the workforce to sort of dress as they wanted. And, it still was fairly provocative compared to what was going on in the 1950s, and the 60s sort of shattered that quite a bit. But disco obviously influenced a great deal too in terms of how people dressed and the fashion people were wearing. I think there was a lot of fear and anxiety in the United States. Americans were really weary of high prices, high inflation, gas shortages, what was perceived as threats from the Middle East. Very different than it is now, and I think it's really, looking back, it was my generation who, for a number of reasons I think, but one of them being the rise of cable television and the kind of cultural anxiety that brought with it, but also I think a lot of families transitioned from a single income household to a dual household. So with two parents working, I think a lot of parents felt guilty and in many ways started to hover over their children. And I mean, I remember as a child, I grew up in a family of 5 kids, and I knew my parents loved me, and I knew they cared about me and watched over me, and I felt protected. But I felt like when I was growing up, I had a lot of freedom, and I certainly don't feel like that is the case anymore. In the summer in particular, I was able to get on my bike and go anywhere I wanted, and I had to check in for lunch and dinner. But other than that, I was off and I was doing whatever I wanted. And that kind of freedom and exploration, I just don't see anymore. And I think it's a detriment to how we're bringing up young people these days, because I don't think we're teaching young people to, first of all, have that sense of freedom of choice and expression. I think we're raising a culture of people that don't really feel like they have to take responsibility for anything because they're constantly being watched. I think we're living sort of a paranoid culture as a result of that. I mean, I knew to be careful. I knew to, watch what was going on and be aware, but I don't feel like I grew up with the same sort of nervousness young people do today, and I think that's unfortunate. I think the real shift that happened in the 1970s was in terms of family relationships. I think that there was a huge tide of divorce that began in the 1960s and sort of reached its peak in the 1970s, where people felt like they had the freedom to end marriages and find their own path. I think this 1970s, especially in the beginning, were a continuation of the 60s in the sense that people felt like a sense of autonomy, a sense of freedom, a sense of being an individual apart from societal dictates or religious dictates. And I think obviously the 1970s continued a real sort of sexual revolution in the United States in terms of people feeling like they didn't have to just be in a monogamous relationship, but they could experiment more before marriage or even within marriage. I mean, certainly there's a lot of documentation about open marriages existing a great deal and that idea expanding a great deal in the 1970s.